I'd like to start simply, really understanding what is the importance of diversity in clinical trials? What value does this bring for society? I'd like to start with you, James, if you could.
Yes, of course. Thank you. And I suppose I see this in the context of being a UK policymaker, so I know this has obviously got a global reach, but I was recently asked to carry out a review of clinical trials for the UK government. And it made me think about this, the sort of rationale, as it were, for diversity almost on three levels. The first is the obvious one, which is the kind of moral or ethical level, which is it is just simply right to give a more diverse group of people the opportunity to take part in clinical trials and clinical research, rather than one group over another, because everyone ought to have equal access to high-quality healthcare, and research is obviously part of that. The second is a more sort of health-related or sociological dimension, which is the fact that the people with the greatest health needs are also those who are least likely to take part in research, and therefore are the ones who will benefit from it most. So if you're interested in closing the health inequity gap, then you ought to be trying to recruit marginalised communities into your trials for the very health benefits it will bring them. And the final element is an economic one. And in some ways, it shouldn't be the most powerful driver, but it is, of course, because so much of the industry is about the allocation of capital. And actually being able to recruit diverse sets of marginalised populations of different types of people into a clinical trial is going to create tremendous economic value as you look as a drug company to promote the drug, if it is a drug that you're taking through a trial, into different markets. Or if you are viewing it from a narrow perspective of a country like the UK, where you've got an incredibly diverse and increasingly diverse population, that gives you the opportunity to have the world's library of genotypes in one place. And it ought to be a superpower. Not every country, of course, has that advantage. But some do. And so they should be thinking about that as a driver of economic value, as well as I said, of sort of health and equity.
Definitely. And James, obviously your work very much focuses at kind of this high-level view and looking at the society as a whole. But Kara, we had a brief conversation earlier about, what does this mean at an individual level? I know you work directly with patients and engage with them on a kind of service delivery perspective. How does this resonate for you, and what's the value of clinical trial diversity from your work?
Sure. I would agree with everything that James said. Perhaps I can give some examples from my work that, like you say, will give the patient factors at play. So I'm a consultant haematologist, and I specialise in one particular blood cancer called multiple myeloma. And myeloma is the second most common blood cancer. It's an incurable disease, but many patients now live between 5 and 10 years following diagnosis because there's been such a therapeutic advancement in recent years. Most of that therapeutic advancement has come through research. However, patients with myeloma can benefit from taking part in clinical trials because we know, for example, through the NCRI trials in myeloma that have taken place over the last 20 to 30 years, for example, in the mid-1970s, the one-year survival for patients on myeloma 4 was around 60%, all the way up to myeloma 11+, which closed in 2014, when we have an almost 100% one-year survival. So there's huge progress there from trials, but we need to make sure that all patient groups are able to take part. And what we see is that trials activity, particularly in the UK, which is my main focus, is largely centred on big centres like my own. We have between 10 and 15 trials for myeloma open, which is great. There's very little else in the whole of South Wales. And I have patients regularly travelling 1 to 2 hours, perhaps using public transport, having to give up work, having to find childcare, to take part in research, which they know might be an opportunity of a lifeline. Although there's been a lot of therapeutic development, that comes at high cost. So to James' point about the economic impact, up to 40% of the NHS England cancer drug spend goes on treating myeloma. Some of these drugs are eye-wateringly expensive. If we recruit patients to trials, often we're able to give drugs for free, as well as offering patients drugs that they couldn't access elsewhere. And for many patients, they can come at a time when they've used up all the options that are funded through NICE. So it's not just about creating that opportunity for one group in society. That opportunity has to be there for all groups in society. But if we can't expand access, then many groups will miss out. And James's point about the ethnic diversity in the UK, the genetic link. Myeloma, for example, is more common in people from African origin. And also, myeloma is more severe. It can be harder to treat. It relapses more quickly in people from those backgrounds. If they're not eligible to take part in trials or able, that group is missing out, and that's an unmet need. Plus, the data that we get from those trials is obviously not representative of perhaps people with the greatest needs. So there's some examples to relate everything that he said to clinical practice.
Thank you so much, Kerry. So really, really interesting what you're bringing forward in terms of how it changes people's lives. But Eduardo, I'd love to come to you. We've heard from the moral perspective that there is a real need to make a difference. There's an economic side to that. It's valuable. And we've also heard that it actually has an impact on people's lives directly. But thinking about the development, thinking about treatment efficacy and safety, from your perspective and the work that you do, what value does diversity in clinical trials bring?
Well, from the patient point of view, they have also an analysis of the risk-benefit that they can obtain from the participation in the clinical trial. And this is clear because in some therapeutic areas, it's the patient who is looking for a clinical trial where he can be admitted. In some others, that's not the case. So the clinical benefit is also relevant for the participation of the patient in the clinical trials. Another aspect that is also interesting, or the patient try to look, is that, okay, I will receive the treatment during the trial, but what happened after that? If I have obtained a benefit, I have to wait until the drug is in the market, and unfortunately, the drugs are reach the market in different speed in different countries. Mm-hmm. So this is also an aspect that we have to, apart from the cultural of these patients, that makes the patient to participate or not participate in the clinical trial.
Definitely. So there is value from a scientific perspective to even to do this. So it's clearly a valuable investment. It's something that we need to be thinking about, and I think that's why we're all here, but it's not happening, and it's obviously not easy to do. Rajan, I'd love to ask you the next question, which is, what would you say are the key barriers? What is preventing making progress in making clinical trials represent some of the populations that are most impacted?
Thanks, Amy. I think if you'll allow me to just step back a little bit as well and comment on the first question. And for me, I approach it maybe slightly controversially, being essentially someone who runs a cancer drug development business. But the answer's in the word trial. Why do we trial medicines? We're trialing them in a limited population to see how they might respond in a larger population. If the population you're trialing your medicine in does not reflect the population you're going to then apply it to, the trial isn't going to work. And we see this in every single medicine, certainly in cancer, because of essentially the skew towards a white Caucasian population that sits in the trials. When you put them in the market, response rates drop to the point that whilst you might have a regulatory approval sitting in the 30-40% mark, you put it into the market, it drops below 20%. And that does mean that 80% of the patients you treat, think about it from a government payer perspective, not just a patient perspective, aren't responding or aren't being helped in that way. So I do think it is about making sure you're doing absolutely the right thing to represent the population you're eventually going to want to treat. And so moving into the question that you asked, what can be done? Lots, but it starts, I think, in three core buckets. The first is education. Education leads to empowerment, and that's education of two key groups. One is absolutely the patient population and their ecosystem. I come at this from a specific cancer lens, but I think it also applies to any other form of trial, whether it's cardiovascular or otherwise. You have a patient, but you have an ecosystem around that patient that is their family, their friends, their interested parties. Their awareness drives their knowledge, and that knowledge gives them empowerment, which then leads to a transaction that leads to, hopefully, access to better care. But it's also education and empowerment to the physicians. Most of the people that don't get access to clinical trials fall into low socioeconomic groups. Most of the people who represent low socioeconomic groups are in the ethnic minority group as well, and they don't get access to, let's call it, higher quality healthcare. And that is because the doctors they have access to, this is no criticism, aren't as educated and empowered as the ones that everyone else has access to, plus the resources they have available. Then you have the socioeconomic balance that says, okay, if you're in a particular group, you cannot afford to get in a car drive 200 miles to a trial station where you can then get your drug and then be observed for a week. Because who's looking after your children? You need to then look at decentralizing those trials. That's the second key bucket. And the fear, if you like, even with cancer clinical trials of, oh no, we can't give dangerous chemicals to patients sitting at home. Well, actually you can, you just have to be sensible about monitoring those patients. So education, empowerment of those groups, decentralized clinical trials is a second bucket. And the third one, I think, is really, this is for the policymakers in the room and those who write treatment paradigms. Clinical trials should not be seen, in my mind, as the end of the line. They need to form part of the treatment paradigm at different points in time. Whilst they're probably not the first line of therapy, they can be second, third, fourth. They don't have to be limited to the point in time where you are moribund with a terminal diagnosis. And I think we need to change that sort of narrative and allow clinical trials to fit into the treatment paradigms a bit better.
Oh, really interesting. So clearly there's an aspect of social economic position that impacts the diversity, education, and various other factors. But James, you mentioned a bit of an evaluation that took place on clinical trial diversity. What are the key barriers that emerge from that? What are the challenges to making clinical trials as diverse as they should be?
Yeah, I mean, Rajan's, I think, given some brilliant examples of the kind of actions you need to take to address the problem. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of bringing trials closer to people with decentralized approaches. Part of the problem with decentralized trials, which is a sort of fantastic idea and suitable for some diseases more so than others at the moment, is that there is the very clear regulatory framework to operate in. In fact, almost no countries have a really thorough regulatory framework for decentralized trials. Probably Denmark seems to be the furthest ahead. But that's one part of it, is you just take this aspect of healthcare, which, as Rajan quite rightly says, is what it is, closer to people. And that's not now a technical challenge, actually. The technology exists to do it. It's probably practical and ethical and regulatory. So that's the first thing, is how can you use the regulatory system almost to reverse engineer activity by saying you've got to have trials closer to people and an expectation that there's greater diversity within them. I think that's absolutely critical. Another point which I would, or solution I'd point to is a very simple one, which is just counting and publishing. Most people who are engaged in this kind of industry want to do the right thing, but often operating with poor knowledge actually about what's happening. If we publish data about the kind of trials that are happening, what's available, who's on them, actually performance against standard, where it's recruitment standards, time to set up, but also diversity and other elements, most people will start to understand that they want to perform better over time. And so that makes it both easier for patients to find out about trials, but also to hold people to account for greater diversity. I think the final thing I'd say is around sort of professional incentivization. And we have to be careful here, because that can cross a line. I think particularly in a European context, we're not super comfortable with explicitly paying clinicians individually to recruit people into trials. But there are financial incentives that you could think of using within contracts, things like clinical academic fellowships and other ways, perhaps more sort of peer or professional recognition that would value it. And as I say, my sort of sense is that people do want to do the right thing. They're often sure not how to do it. And they're often not rewarded or recognised for doing it, and indeed their performance can often go under the radar if they are doing the right thing. So I think if we think about that as a sort of set of policy solutions, in a way it would liberate people to do the right thing, which, as I said, I think is where most people want to behave.
Really interesting, and definitely highlights the kind of policy aspect that exists in addition to the regulatory aspect. But Kerry, you touched on a really important topic earlier on in terms of access and some of the challenges you've seen in your patient population in accessing clinical trials. Beyond taking the clinical trials to the populations, which is clearly an intervention that's happening, but not necessarily reaching everyone that needs to be reached, what else can be done to make clinical trials more accessible to some of these populations?
I think the point about access can't be understated, to be honest. We're never going to reach as many people as we'd like to if we don't have enough centres doing research. So there is an urgent need for investment in facilities to support trials. Why do we need so much resource? Because it's expensive. So when we run a clinical trial, we have to comply with good clinical practice, and that's a set of guidelines that sets out everything we need to do and treat subjects on trials ethically. We need additional doctors, nurses, pharmacists, data managers, admin support to collect the data that the trials companies ask for, and all of that investment comes at a price. So that is the reason why there has been the attrition that James has characterised in the UK in recent years, and if we don't take urgent measures to reverse that, it will continue to be the case. I'd like to go back to the point that was made earlier about licensing of treatments, because I think this is a very important point. So cancer drugs, for example, can be granted a license on the basis of data from 500 patients in a clinical trial. And often they are a very uniform population, and that efficacy doesn't play out in the real world. So we need to reach as many sections of the population in order to make the real world evidence fit with actually what we see. In terms of making trials more accessible to patients, though, it's about having language barriers overcome. So trials literature needs to be presented in a way that doesn't just get across language divides, but also means of communication. Some forms of communication are just not relevant to many groups. For example, a 50-page patient information sheet for someone who has, low literacy achievement in the past is not necessarily going to be relevant. Perhaps a more digital, in-touch means of communication and consent would overcome that barrier. And the other huge one, so language accessibility, but also mistrust. And mistrust in research is manyfold. We all have a duty of care to generate trust, and we talked about this in one of the sessions earlier, but unfortunately research does seem to suffer more than other topics, perhaps, because of this idea that people are guinea pigs, and that can play out in certain sections of society more than others. So I think in order to make trials accessible, we need to think about all those barriers in everything that we do. I think research for all should be the goal. I would actually make the point that we do run trials at all stages of the disease, from newly diagnosed to relapse, and all of them are beneficial. In fact, the newly diagnosed ones are often more beneficial. But there is so much work that needs to be done to embed this into routine care.
Really interesting, and I really liked your point around mistrust. I think that's one of the issues that have been raised across some of the various sessions that we've had today. And James, I saw you nodding when that comment was raised. What do you think can be done to address some of the historical traumas that exist and are resulting in mistrust in populations?
Yeah, and when I was a government minister in the Department of Health, one of the things I was responsible for was medicine and medical device regulation. And the exciting part of that is you see all the sort of innovative drugs, and when things are going well and transforming, even saving lives. The bad bit is when things go wrong, which is rare, but does happen. Adverse events happen. We instigated a review with Baroness Cumberledge into medicine and medical device safety. So, and then you meet families who are affected, and they are often from, or more likely to be, from a less well-off, more marginalised group. So you sort of see that in action. And I think that even though the vast majority of medicine does good for most people, there are these edge cases. And so I think what I come down to with that, and I think the trust issue is critical, is ultimately this whole enterprise starts with patients. I mean, it's easy to view this from the lens of healthcare delivery or science, but it's all about ultimately helping to make people live longer, happier, healthier lives. I mean, it sounds like a sort of vague statement of motherhood and apple pie, but it is true. And if that is the case, then you then have to engage with those individuals or groups in how they view healthcare system, which is very much not uniform. And you see this, I think, a lot in the arena of health data, which I know isn't the kind of exact topic of our discussion, but which does feed into this. So obviously the generation of data is what clinical trials are about. Some people are incredibly skeptical about how their health data will be used. They just do not trust the government or even the NHS, let alone the pharmaceutical industry and others, unless certain safe procedures are put in place. But actually, when you look at fantastic patient and public engagement activities that happen, Genomics England does this brilliantly, for example, and there are many others. You see people kind of go on a journey of discovery about what they want to happen. And what's interesting is they often come out of that with a sort of, we must be part of this. We must share this data in the right way, safe and ethical, all the rest of it, because it improves my participation in a trial is going to improve lives for other people, and it kind of unlocks that altruistic instinct. But it has to start with engaging with people, not consulting them after the fact, but actually giving them agency over the process. And then I think you do see a transformation.
Yeah, definitely. That intrinsic nature and putting patients right at the center of what is ultimately for patients. Eduardo, I'd love to come to you and ask you a bit more about some of the digital or innovative solutions that exist to make clinical trials more diverse.
Yes, we are a research institution. And in this case, we are working in two lines. One line is to analyze the data from the patients we have in the clinical trial and to elaborate algorithms in order to predict what would be the response for the particular patient or the likelihood of having a side effect. And we can elaborate these algorithms that can be, in our experience, if you elaborate the algorithms with the population you have, it can be applied to other ethnicities. So that's one thing. In some cases, with a small variation in the weight of the different variables you have included in the algorithm. So that's one thing. We are also working on understanding the significance in the translation of the single point mutations. What is the meaning in the function of the proteins and the implications in the clinical presentation of the patient. We are also working, another line is making more easy for the patient to participate in the clinical trials. So we have developed different tools that can monitor the patient at home perfectly. We have also working with the smartphone in order to collect data from different areas. That's another area we can offer the pharmaceutical companies in order to increase the capability to include patients in the clinical trials. And also we are working on another line is the organoids. The organoids is we can take samples, cells from the patients or cells from normal health people. We can introduce even some modifications in the genetics in these cells, differentiate the cells, and we can have a model of the patient, but in vitro setup. And we can analyze the function of the different drugs and the response or the side effects of these drugs. So this is another, this can be used also to validate the algorithms that we have elaborated. And this can be also to easily incorporate some patients that is difficult to include in regular clinical trials.
So the innovations exist to make clinical trials more innovative, very scientific, but they exist, they're operational. Rajan, I'd love to next ask you the next question, which is, when we think about clinical trial capacity and when we look geographically, we see that a lot of clinical trials and clinical trial capacity sits within high-income countries. Another way to think about diversity when it comes to clinical trials is just where they take place. The populations will clearly differ.
100%.
What's to be said about that?
As a very astute observation, actually, you're right. Most clinical trials, especially in advanced medicine, happen outside of the developing world rather. So you know, whether you're looking at, say, for example, gastric cancer patients, the gross majority you find in Southeast Asia, for advanced aggressive breast or prostate cancer, you need to look at in the African populations and so on and so forth. And that's absolutely critical. What's really interesting is historically we've always thought that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the capability. There's some awesome facilities actually out there. The rate limiting factor is usually down to the fact that when you qualify into medicine in Jomo Kenyatta Hospital in Nairobi, you are busy from day one. You have more patients you can swing a stick at, and you don't have time to go and do that research degree that then makes you credible with the OECD, with the FDA, to then make sure that the data you could garner in that trial site, if you could run a trial, would be valid. So I think it is on us as drug developers, as biotechs, pharma companies, whichever way you looked at it, as well as the policymakers, to try and see, well, how can we, whether it's roll out OECD accreditation across multiple sites globally, whether it is bring the training and the education that we currently have in the Occidental healthcare economies out there and say, okay, how do we train people from a research perspective? The more credible you can make the data acquisition piece, the easier it is for those geographically disparate sites to then generate data that seem to be more valid. And little initiatives like, for example, the Gordon McVie Fellowships are seeking to try and do something like that based here in the UK, where they're sort of handpicking physicians who sit in, it's in cancer, but in very high quality units around the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and are offering them an opportunity to come and do a vocational fellowship, which is essentially remote, bar 1 month in the UK over a 1 year period, giving them a research qualification and helping them build the skills that will allow them to then run a trials unit there. Then, of course, you've got Kerry's point, which is very well made. You still need a nurse manager, a trial nurse. You still need a data scientist, still need a biostatistician. And I think that's where, for example, the work that Eduardo's doing and the stuff that James was alluding to, and that is using a digital interface, you can potentially reduce the burden for on-the-ground, human skills that allow geographically disparate sites to then make it more relevant for trials.
Definitely, and you're right in that the capacity does exist when we look at diseases like Lassa fever or some of the more neglected tropical diseases. There is a lot of capacity in addressing some of those challenges in continents like sub-Saharan Africa. Thinking more on the ethical side of things, what ethical considerations, James, do we need to factor into engaging these more diverse populations that may be vulnerable in other ways?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm going to end up slightly repeating myself here, but I think it is understanding. I mean, as Kerry was bringing out, this is not just a one-size-fits-all process. And a lot of, and I don't think necessarily through anybody's fault, but a lot of these kind of procedures of how you engage patients, how you gain consent, they're seen as kind of compliance, something you have to go through, and ideally not have to think about too much. Whereas from what I've seen, the more enlightened approaches actually start with patient groups. Now, it's more demanding, right, because it's more time-consuming. But I think this is where the point about different approaches to clinical trials come in, because they're expensive to do, clinical trials, increasingly expensive to do, and in certain areas they're extremely expensive to do, either because the cost of the drug or because you need large numbers. I think a really important sort of ethical consideration for clinical trials is actually getting the cost of them down, so that more people can participate, we can take them into more communities, which is why there's a real urgency about how we reform them and how we use digital technology to transform them, actually. And we're seeing a bit of that, but I think that's kind of a wave that's in its infancy still. So there are lots of, as we've discussed, there are lots of ways and certainly lots of reasons why we should think about this at this point. But actually, what we need actually is a sort of wave of innovation to the methodology and the regulatory process, because that in itself will enable us to have the resources that we need to be more careful about making sure diverse groups take part.
Definitely, and you raise a point that we haven't touched on too much, is just the financial aspect, the cost of clinical trials. And we know that, funding is very competitive and sometimes hard to come across. I do want to open the floor to the audience to see if there are any questions that you'd like to raise to our panelists.
There's one just there, you probably can't see them.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for the panel. So I have a question that I would like to address to all the panelists, and it's about technology advancement in healthcare that I've been talking about in the morning. So that's particularly talking about the AI in drug development. So do you see that as a driver for better diversity in clinical trials, or as a hindrance, or implications in general, and how is the industry leveraging on that?
Really interesting.
We'd all like to do more, is the simple answer. To give you an idea, in trials, often there'll be patients in cancer who die in remission. So in theory, the treatment's worked, but there will be differential outcomes between people who might appear similar at the beginning. If we could harness the power of AI to go back and look at actually all the medical factors, all the background social economic factors relevant to that patient, comorbidities, health outcomes, all of those kind of things, we might be able to unlock some of this data around why certain patients do well and certain patients do less well. We are led to believe that it's because they had treatment A and not treatment B, when actually humans are such a complex organism. Treatment is such a precise yet often imprecise science, and we are drawing conclusions based on a very narrow set of data points, and if we had all the data available probably we would uncover a lot of things that could be beneficial.
On the other hand, for another indication, not in oncology, this can be easy to obtain and easy to analyze. And also because the clinical trials is an artificial study, because we don't have to forget about the low adherence to the treatment in the real life. So these kind of algorithms can identify the people who could obtain the best benefit from this therapy. And the physician has to identify these patients and convince them that they have to follow the treatment. Because here we will have a real value.
I think that's a really good point. Demonstrating the value of research is obviously relevant to all, but perhaps those who are more skeptical or have the greatest concern would feel the benefit of that the most. So we need to make sure we have that data available, but it has to be relevant to me, whoever I am, and I shouldn't be compared to someone who, for various different reasons, is actually nothing like me.
And I think I wholeheartedly agree with everything my esteemed colleagues have said. Just to address your question, though, it was about discovery, is that correct? AI discovery of sort of new medicines. And I think we have to look at what we mean by either machine learning or artificial intelligence-based in silico drug discovery. It's based on the information we put in that drives the algorithm that gives you the output. We've heard discussions earlier today about how women are different to men, quite rightly, and they are different physiological organisms as well as biological organisms to men. We know that children are not mini human beings. We know that different people from different ethnicities and different socioeconomic backgrounds are physiologically and sometimes biologically different. And so that drives a need to populate your AI algorithms with a huge amount of data, which we don't have. And I'm not aware that even some of the biggest data harvesting organizations on the planet have managed to get in a representative way. So I'm going to go completely to the wrong side of the fence and say, no, I don't think AI is going to represent the population that you need to until the data in is of higher quality.
We had another question.
Thank you. So my name is Bernard. I'm a clinical research fellow at KCL, and I also am a trainee psychiatrist. So I take part in a lot of trials, both on the private side and on the public side. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on participant compensation, which is very different on the two sides. And there are different arguments being put towards it being higher in terms of attracting, compensating people for their time, but also perhaps some people of lower economic means, they can't travel, they can't do all of that, and actually then it skews people towards being richer, participating in trials. People have time, people don't need to be compensated, but then maybe we are unduly influencing people. So I was wondering how you think about compensating people for taking part in trial in view of enhancing diversity.
Can I take this from a clinical trial sponsor side of things? I'm not going to look at this from an ethics perspective. I think my esteemed colleagues are better positioned for that than me. Healthy volunteer trials are very different to looking at patients with disease that need to essentially have treatments in that trial. As someone who sponsors clinical trials as a business, all the costs are met. Travel costs are met. Inconvenience costs are met. If they need food when they're there because they have to have a four-hour infusion, those costs are met. So we try as an ethical business to try and make sure that the impact on attending a center to get your trial medicine and be part of the trial is as low in terms of burden for that individual as possible. There are restrictions, and I mentioned earlier. So, for example, it's very difficult if you've got the main carer for the children who's going onto the trial to then make sure that you've got something in place for that individual at home. But whether it's transport, whether it's food, whether it's trying to bring the trial as close to that individual as possible, local centres as well as just not just at home, we try as much as we can. And so the paying for participation, certainly in oncology and cancer indication, I'm not aware of any of our patients who have even thought about it for a second, just irrespective of where they are on the socioeconomic strata. But ethically, I think there are different debates, obviously.
I think, to echo that point, nobody should be financially disadvantaged by taking part in research, and yet they are. So my patient, for example, from Mid Wales, who travels 2 hours every week on the bus, also had to quit her job. So those are challenges that we need to get over. She's lucky she had the luxury of being able to do that and afford her treatment. If she didn't, who knows, would she still be alive? So I think those are challenges. I'm not in favour of paying patients to take part in cancer research trials. I think, frankly, it would just not be necessary. There is demand, but often the demand is from a more monotonous population. And we actually need to work hard to make sure that it's not those who are the most able, and you can choose your definition of able, that get the research spots and get the money in payment. It's everybody gets a chance at the table. And I think there's a danger that paying people to take part in research could actually skew that even more.
Well, thank you. Really, really interesting way to end the conversation. I would like to thank my esteemed panelists for their insights. It's clear that there are challenges when we think about diversity in clinical trials. They range from socioeconomic challenges, they range from historical challenges in relation to trauma, but solutions exist. Some of them are quite practical, improving access, bringing trials to the populations. Some of them are more advanced, thinking about the opportunities that exist with AI and other technologies. And also there are policy solutions, thinking about who to engage, what aspects of society, and obviously there is an economic and moral need to do more. So please join me in thanking the panelists for their insights shared today.